Hi, Dave Scotland here for cgswot.com, and today we'll be in Photoshop doing a tutorial on a little bit of photo manipulation, and we're also going to paint some elements over the top of the photo and use a few techniques to just marry those elements into the photo and have them appear as if they're in the original photo. And this is the end result that we're shooting for. It's Megan Fox of Transformers fame, and it's just an image I pilfered from Google Image, and we'll be starting with this. This is the image that I grabbed from Google Image, and we're shooting for this effect here. So we'll get started. We'll just bring up our layers menu, and the only thing we have is our original layer. So we're just going to duplicate that first layer, and we're going to rename this black and white, BW. We're just going to try and name our layers, make them a little more meaningful at a glance. Now if we go up to the image, adjustment and desaturate, that gives us our black and white image, and that's all we need for now. Now if you highlight the original image, we're just going to hide that black and white for now. Highlight the original image, and down the bottom here we're going to add an adjustment layer using the adjustment button, and we'll be using hue and saturation, and we're going to tick the colorize, and that bluey green color is the one we're looking for. Basically just keep an eye on the eyes. This adjustment layer is only for the eyes, and so we'll bring the saturation up. We'll bring the lightness up slightly, a little bit more saturation, maybe bring it into, that's probably what we're looking for. So let's bring up our layers and unhide the black and white, and we're just going to zoom in to the eyes, and with the black and white layer selected we're going to click on the create layer mask or add layer mask, and that just brings up a layer mask here, and it's all white, which means it's a reveal, in its reveal state. And we're going to paint using the brush tool, and if we swap our swatches around so that black is our color, we're just going to scale down a little bit. We'll check the brush, and it's going to be fine. We want it probably about 90% in hardness, no spacing. And we're just going to zoom in a little further, and we're just going to paint out these eyes, just the pupils. Just like so. And if you do make a mistake like that, you can just swap the swatches around and repaint over the top. Now that brush is a little bit hard, so we're just going to bring up our brush and soften it on the edges a bit, and we'll go back in there and just soften the edge, and then we'll paint back over the edge. So swap our swatches, and we're just going to paint in the pupil. Now the highlight, the white highlight in the eye, we want to keep that white because it won't be blue. So we'll swap our swatches and just make sure we keep that highlight white. And the other thing we need to do is keep the center part of the pupil black, like so. And that's starting to look pretty good. Smooth this off a little over the top. A little bit more off the bottom. Now we'll move over to the other eye. and make sure our swatch is black. And we'll go around fairly rough, and then we'll come back and delete some using the white swatch. So swap them over. We'll come back in there. And that looks pretty close to what we need. We'll just zoom out, and if we highlight our hue and saturation, we just want to reduce the opacity, and that's looking pretty good. That's pretty much what we need for the eyes. So the next thing we need to do is create our mask. So if we just hide our layers for now, I've drawn up this grid to help us do guides, and we'll use our pen tool, and we're just going to click in the center here, and then we're going to click up the top, give it a bit of bend, and then we're going to click on the side, and then down the bottom here, and then up on the bridge of the nose, and then try to mimic what you've done there along the bottom, up the side, and over the top. And then back to the center. Now our center there is a little bit too pointed, so we'll use the convert point tool. We'll click on the center and drag out, and that just gives us a nice curve. So the next thing we need to do is put our eye cutouts. We're just going to create in the center here, one above the eye, one out here on the side, one down underneath, and one back here. And we'll use our convert tool again. Our starting point, we need to make sure it's a little bit smoother, and this one out here we're going to grab our anchors and make it a teardrop type shape, and the one across the bottom, that's probably pretty good. Now we're just going to use our direct select tool, grab that point there and move it up slightly, grab this one, just move it out slightly, move that one down, and we'll just move this one up slightly, something like that. So we'll mimic that on the left hand side. Click one here, one in the middle, one out to the side here, one underneath, and back to the center. And we'll use our convert tool just to change those. This one here, we want a nice sort of smooth curve there, and the one on the edge here, we'll bring the anchors in, give it a teardrop, and we'll just Play with these slightly. We'll use our direct select tool. Just bring this over like that, and the top one, just take it out a little bit, and we'll just move this guy up a little bit. About there's fine. We just might move this one back out slightly, out there, and that's looking pretty good. So what we can do now is use our path select. We'll select that path, and using the shift button, so if we select the outer path, use the shift button to select the two eye sockets, bring up our layers, and what we want to do is create a new layer, and we'll make this bluey green color, a little bit deep. Click OK, just go edit, fill, and we're going to fill with the foreground color, which is the blue we've just selected, and click OK. Now with our mask selected here, we're going to right click on it, and we're going to create vector mask, and we're left with the mask, and that looks pretty good. That's what we're looking for. Okay, so we're just going to do some layer blending and layer options here. So if you right click and bring up the blending options, and that brings up our blending window here. I'm just going to close that layer panel down so we can see what we're doing, and I'll just minimize our picture and bring it over to the side. Trying to work with not a lot of real estate here. And the first thing we need to do is do a drop shadow, and the settings we're going to play with, we're going to keep it, the drop shadow is going to be normal, and the opacity will be about 40 to 40%. Whoop, let's bring that back up again. Opacity at 40% on the drop shadow, and we'll just switch off the use global light, and we're going to turn the angle to 90 degrees, and the distance is just 1 pixel, and the spread about 30. We'll make it 34, 35. Yeah, that's fine. And the size, let's make it about 50, 54. That should be fine. And that's it for the drop shadow. And the next thing we need to do is an inner shadow. So if we click the inner shadow, and this one's going to be a multiply, and we're going to leave the opacity at 75, and we're going to untick the use global there, and this time we're going to sort of reverse the angle, make it -90, and we'll probably just increase the choke quite a bit. Let's kick it up to about 50, make it 48, and the size about 10 or 9, and we'll just change the contour to a curve, and that's probably what we want there for inner shadow. So we'll also do a bevel and emboss. So if we just tick bevel and emboss, and we're going to do an inner bevel, so we'll leave that as is. Smooth is fine. The depth, yeah, we'll bring the depth up quite a bit. Probably, yeah, about 184 is fine. The direction we're going to have up, size about 1 pixel, and softness we'll leave at 0. Now the angles, we'll go 0 on the angle and 90 on the altitude, and screen and multiply is fine as well. Now we're also going to use a bit of a contour here, and we'll also include a texture, and the texture we're looking for, feel free to play around with these textures. That's probably the one I want. I want to probably play with the scale here, just bring it down to about 95, and the depth we're going to crank this right up to about 418. I'll just zoom in a little bit on this picture so we can see what we're doing a little better. Just go back into that texture there, link to layer. Yep, no, that's fine. And we're also going to use a satin, and the satin is going to be an overlay with an opacity of about 69. And the angle will bring up to 90. Distance about 10. Size will set to about 8, and we're going to leave invert on that one, and that contour is fine. And we're also going to do a gradient overlay, and the gradient overlay will be a color burn. So if we come down to, where is it, color burn, 33% on the opacity, line with layer, yes, linear 90%, and scale at 100%. So that's fine. And the next thing we need to do is our stroke. And we'll do an inside stroke of 3 pixels with the blending mode is on normal. That's fine. And we don't want color, we want gradient. And if I click in here, I've actually pre-done a gold trim, but you'll see here that all it is a sort of a goldy color going into a little bit darker, into a white, back to a darky gold, back to a white, and then out to our original gold. We'll click OK to that, and that just gives us our banding around the edge. And we're looking pretty good here. Now if we just come up to our blending options at the top, we want to turn this into color, and we'll click OK to that. Quite a lot involved in that process, but as you can see, it's sort of it's dealt with quite a lot of the effect just in those blending modes there. And we'll just bring the opacity down on that layer to about 65. Make it about 75. Let's make it 85. And that's looking pretty good. So let's move on now. We're going to actually duplicate that layer. And if we name the layer Mask Color 1, and we'll duplicate it to Mask Color 2, click OK, and the bottom layer we will drop that down to 65, and the top layer We'll leave that on about 75, and that's looking okay. Now the next thing we need to do is we'll drop some shadows underneath our mask. So if we come down to our black and white image and create a new layer, and we'll just rename this Mask Shadows Under. Click OK. I'm going to turn this into a multiply layer, and we're going to go with a black and bring up our brush tool, and this time we'll use quite a soft brush, so really take the softness out of that, give it a little bit of spacing, and we also just increase the size of it, something like this, and we're going to reduce the opacity down to about 9, and just to make sure that we're in the right, we're only underneath the mask and not over the top of it, because remembering this mask is a color overlay, so if we do go underneath, it'll come on top of the mask. So what we need to do is just control click on our mask, vector mask, then we're going to hold Control Shift I to invert that selection, and now when we paint, it'll only be outside the mask. So go ahead and paint in some shadow detail, and just this will help to marry it into the image and make it feel like it is part of that image. And just go around the edges there and put it in, and then lighten it up with the eraser tool, which we'll do in a sec. So we just want to get that detail in there, that shadow detail. So it's okay to go a little darker, so we can always come back. We'll just lighten that up with the eraser tool just shortly. So if we switch over to the eraser tool, and we'll make sure our brush is also fairly soft, and it is, and opacity of about 10 is fine, and we just want to increase the size there. And in certain areas, like at the nose here, it comes in close to the face, so we want to reduce that through there, have it sort of fall away a bit. And at the top here, we'll reduce it somewhat, it's a little bit dark. Around the sides, we'll leave it where it is. Just across the top here, we'll reduce it. Now if we go back to our brush tool and just decrease the size of the brush, come in here a little tighter, and we can just give it just a much tighter shadow in certain areas. So we want that there. We also, just inside the eye here, we want it fairly close. Across here. Fairly dark up in the corner there. Across the top. Like so. Same on this eye. Fairly dark in there. And this all goes towards marrying that in. It's probably a little bit dark around that eye, so we'll switch back to our eraser tool, and we'll just lighten it up a little in the center. We'll Just come out now, see how that's reading. Might just hide our guides. Control D to get rid of that selection. And it's starting to read as if it's on the face a little better now. We'll just use the eraser tool to just reduce this a little more around the nose. That's probably pretty good. Reduce it a little bit more across the top. And those eyes are looking a little too dark. What we can do is just select a layer and bring the opacity down a little. And that's working fine. Okay, so let's move on now. We need to give a little bit of decorative feel to the mask, and we're going to do that using our pen tool again. So we'll just scroll these up a little bit, and we'll bring up our pen tool, and we're just going to click in the center here, or just off the center. Go with something like that, and we'll just smooth that a little, give this a little bit more of a curve. Pull these guys over a bit. Something like that. Okay, now that we've got that shape, we're going to just create a new layer, and if we right click on the shape, we can stroke the path and click OK, and with the path selected, we're just going to hit edit, transform path, flip horizontally, and we're just going to move it across. Just line it up so that it's touching there. We're going to right click, stroke the path, and now we're going to delete the path. Now with that layer selected, we're going to come down into our mask color, and we're going to right click, copy layer, copy layer style, and up here we're going to right click and paste layer style. Or actually the drop shadow, we'll just go into the drop shadow, we'll leave it on, but we'll tighten it right up. We'll bring the spread right in and the size in about 6 and 6, distance to 0, and bring the opacity up so we can see what we're doing, and we'll change this from color to normal. Bring the opacity up and we'll click OK to that, and that's working pretty well. Let's just reduce the opacity slightly, and that'll help just marry it in a little bit to the mask, and that's coming along okay. We'll just rename that Mask Deco. So we'll move on now to some highlights, and if we come in, well, the first thing we'll do actually, we'll put some shadow. So if you create a new layer, and we'll call this Mask Shadow Over, and we're going to turn it to a multiply layer, and we're going to use our paintbrush. We'll go into our brushes, make sure it's quite large and soft, and that's probably going to do us. We'll bring our opacity down to about 10, and we're just going to reduce the size a little bit. We're going to paint up the side, and we'll just use our mask by hitting Control and on the mask to bring up our mask. And this time we do want to stay inside, and just by painting on the side here, we'll paint a little bit in the, just in where the nose is here, and a little bit on this side as well. And we want a little bit over the eye, and then the same down the side here. And that's looking pretty good. We just need to erase a little bit. So we'll just bring up our eraser tool and just go across the eyebrows there. It's looking pretty good. And just a little bit, bring a little bit back in on the cheeks. That's pretty good there. Control D that, and you'll see that that makes quite a difference to marrying the effect into the face. And we're just going to reduce that slightly. Bring it down to about 75. Now we'll create a new layer again, and this time we're just going to drag this down underneath the color masks, and we're going to select our select our mask just on that layer so that we're inside the mask only. We're going to swap over to a white swatch. We're going to use our paintbrush, and we're just going to do some highlights, just a little bit underneath the eyes here. Slide it over, a little bit more underneath that eye, like so. Make it a little larger, come down the center of the nose, V it out slightly, and just go across the eyebrows. Slide it over a little bit more across the eyebrows up here. This is just going to give a little bit of highlight, a little bit more on that nose area. A bit more on the cheek. Control D just to undo that selection. And that's looking pretty good. And let's just reduce the opacity of it slightly. It's a little bit harsh. Bring it up to about 50% should do it. And that's looking pretty good. Okay, so we're just about done. Now what we want to do is do our classic Vaseline effect over the top of the whole image. And we do this by using Control Shift Alt E, and what that does is creates a layer based on all of the visible layers. And so there's that image there, and what we're going to do is turn it to a screen, which you'll see will blow things out quite a bit. But then we're just going to use a filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and then we're just going to reduce that down probably about 20 or 30 is all we need. We'll make it 28. Click OK to that, and we're just going to reduce the opacity slightly, There we go. You'll see that also that's gotten rid of quite a lot of the blemishes on the character. And we can just bring our shadow up a little bit, our under shadow, and just drop our highlights down a little bit now that they've blown out a little bit. Our overshadow should be fine on about 73, and we might just do a little bit of a white vignette. So let's create a new layer, and just with the white swatch we're going to use the paint bucket tool and click, and that'll go over the top of the whole image. We're just going to reduce the opacity for now. We'll bring up our circular marquee tool. We're just going to concentrate on that center part of the face, and we're just going to cut that out and get rid of the selection, go up to filter, blur, Gaussian blur, and really crank that probably about 75, and we're just going to reduce. We might make that a screen as well, and we're just going to reduce the opacity. And if I come out, you'll see what that does by toggling on and off. Just lightens it up a little bit. We'll maybe bring that down a little bit further, maybe about 13, and that looks pretty good. I might just increase the scale. Out, and that looks like what we're looking for. And now we just might darken it down, and probably the quickest way to do that is to add a new layer and swap these around, give it a paint bucket, and we're just going to drop this right down, and we're just going to make this an overlay layer and bring it up slightly, something like that.